Hello, I'm Vince Poscente, and today we're going to talk about the uncertain future of our workforce. With the pandemic lockdown starting in March 2020, we all experienced a fundamental shift in the relationship we have with work. So the fallout from this and other socioeconomic changes put us all on uncertain territory. What is the future of our work life in America, and how can we best understand the issues of employment in today's business climate? To understand these questions, our guests are Melissa Goebel, who is a business leader with over 20 years experience driving growth and transformation in several industries. Most recently, she was the Chief Human Resources Officer for YPO Inc., which is a global membership association for CEOs around the world. Beside Melissa is Jimmy Taylor. He's the Executive Director for the Dallas Human Resource Management Association and the HR Southwest Conference. As a human resources leader and small business owner, he has helped organizations find and retain the employees they need to thrive today. Thank you both for being with us in the studio today. We're going to talk about not just the state of the workforce we're dealing with, but also the future of the workforce. So, Melissa, why don't we start with you? Why don't we describe some of the things that are existing today with this remote environment at work?
So the remote environment, we were all thrown into it back in March of 2020. That's when we first had our stay-at-home orders. And really businesses had to pivot on a dime to send people home and then to really figure out how to conduct work, how to take care of customers, and how to take care of their people. And for many people, for many organizations, some of them, it took a while to really get up and running. And so we fast forward to today, and some organizations are back full time. Some of them never left because they were considered essential workforces, the service people on the front lines of service or manufacturing. But some of them are still remote or hybrid, and they're trying to navigate that to figure that out. You have on top of that, you have the labor. We have the Great Resignation. We have trying to find talent and retain talent. So there's a whole lot there we can unpack.
Right. Well, let's take a run at it. So,
Okay.
Jimmy, I want to switch over to you. Are employees less engaged today, and what's going on there?
That's an interesting question, Vince. I think for a while they've been less engaged. Has it gotten worse post-pandemic? Slightly. If you look at Gallup's numbers, the actively disengaged group of employees has continued to grow. The sad part is only about a third of our workforce is what we call engaged. The rest of them are either disengaged or actively disengaged. So it's definitely a component of what companies are dealing with, and it's one of the great drivers of the Great Resignation, quite honestly.
Melissa, what are we dealing with? What's most critical in terms of employee engagement today, do you feel?
Well, I think with all of the change, I think people are trying to figure out how to work within that change. And to drive engagement, and really just to talk about what the definition of engagement is, the definition of engagement is when employees are willing to put forth effort beyond what would be normally required to take care of business, take care of customers, take care of each other, respond, and such as that. So with disengaged, they're not doing that. But to find and drive an engaged workforce, you really need to, the person needs to understand where they fit in. So imagine like work is a puzzle. So where does their puzzle piece fit in to hook in with everything else? What magic do they bring? What is their value? How are they considered? Are they part of a group? They feel connected? Are they able to unleash their passion and do their magic? And so when they're not, and when they don't feel connected or valued or listened to, then that's really when the disengagement happens.
Yeah, there's a term, isn't there? This quiet quitting. And Jimmy, I'd like to ask you, first, tell us what that means. I've heard the term a few times, and is this something new, or what's going on?
It's not a new phenomenon. The term, I think, has recently been coined, but it's really this idea that people may stay actively employed with your company, but not really be doing their best work, or potentially any work at all. As Melissa said, it's this whole idea that I'm just not going to give you my best strengths and best talents in the work today. And the key really is, Vince, or just to back up for a second, I don't think it's anything different than we've ever seen before. In fact, people ask me, has the workforce fundamentally shifted? And I don't think it has. Jim Clifton wrote a book around 2000. They measured the workforce around the world to find out what people want. And they were very surprised by the outcome. The number one factor in every country in the world was they wanted access to a good job. I don't think that's changed, but I do think employees' definitions of what is a good job has changed dramatically.
Okay, well, let's switch over to women, and we're going to turn to you, Melissa.
Okay, before we do that, can I add on? I completely agree with Jimmy on this, and I don't think quiet quitting. I was at a thing recently talking about employee experience, and I love the term somebody used. It is just an old wine in a new bottle, because it's been ongoing for a long time.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And I just think recognizing that's important, where people are just wanting to do the bare minimum until they find something else.
Okay, let me toss you this curveball, because we
Please.
haven't talked beforehand. Where are we go if people are actually quiet quitting or whatever? Is this a resolvable issue, given that it's been around for so long?
You always have a portion of the workforce.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Unhappy with my job.
I'm unhappy with my job. I'm unhappy with my boss. They don't realize my brilliance. I don't understand what I'm doing. Nobody's really talked to me. I had an idea, but they don't listen to my ideas. It's always been. Always been that.
Jimmy, you've been at HR Southwest and as an executive director. I mean, what are you hearing in these conferences? What are people saying?
It's the same thing. They're having resignations, high turnover. They can't find the talent, particularly skilled talent. So they're really struggling to fill the seats on the bus, if you will. And to Melissa's point, I think it's completely improvable. Can we solve it 100%? No, probably not. We're dealing with people and we're complex human beings. But we can make it a lot better for individuals. So I do think it's a very solvable situation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that maybe.
All right. Well, if we have time.
Yeah.
We have a half an hour.
Yes.
But women are leaving the workforce in alarming numbers in managerial. You might even be one of those statistics, right?
I might be.
Yeah. And also, in the service industry, a good friend is part of the service industry, and the difficulty with retaining women is something he's really dealing with. So tell us a bit more about what we're dealing with women leaving the workforce. Well,
I'm going to push back on you just a little bit there. And I realize you just asked the question. I'm not answering it right away.
Whose program is this?
Really. I think we also have to talk about men leaving the workforce.
Yeah.
But let's talk about women first.
Yeah.
So women have been leaving the workforce in a large perspective, and there's some studies and some thoughts out there that actually women have lost ground in what we had gained over the last 20 years. And I don't know if that's true or not. I think that's some perspective. But with what all happened during the pandemic, the lack of community, having to take care of children, deciding whether or not this is really worth it, am I being fulfilled? The fulfillment and the lack of feeling respect in their workplace or in their roles is the key main things about why people have left in their roles. Yeah.
How about, any additions to that?
No, I think those are the highlights. Women still disproportionately share the lion's burden of raising kids and even being a caretaker for aging parents. That's a big issue in the workforce today. So I think there's some key drivers that have impacted women more. But statistically, if you look at the APA survey, they're much more likely to feel stress in the workplace than men by a pretty good margin.
So the word burnout comes to mind, and there's some research I pulled up in terms of the American Psychological Association of Work and Wellbeing study. The survey came up with 60% of women are feeling burnout, and close to 50% of men are feeling burnout. So what's your read on that, Jimmy?
I think that's accurate, and I think it comes back to the role and responsibility of the employer and really the individual manager to work through those situations in a positive way so that you can reduce that stress load and really equip all workers, male and female alike, to deal with that stress adequately. And companies are starting to address that, which is one of the things that gives me hope.
And thinking about stress, I mean, the definition of stress is really about having the strain either on you from a psychological or a physical condition where you're not out of control and you don't and you're not able to manage something. And that's really been the last 3 years. We don't know what's coming. You don't know what the next shoe is to drop.
Now, the pandemic, you mentioned earlier that it's accelerated things. What has it accelerated in our workplace today?
I think it has accelerated the ability to work remotely. And I think it's taken what was known, you have an office building, but an office is is an asset. It's a tool in which for people to meet and work together. And remote working virtually is a different way to do it. It's just a different method.
Define the term hybrid workforce, because that needs clarification.
Okay. Hybrid is where you have a mixture of where you can work in the office or work in a facility with other people, or you're working virtually from another place.
Right.
Home, Starbucks, a coffee shop.
Any place.
Any place. Yeah.
So what about, Jimmy, this is a tough question. What about workers that can't work remotely or hybrid workforce? What's happening to them in today's workforce?
Well, they're one of the key drivers of the rising stress in the workplace because they don't have that opportunity. They're frontline workers. They've got to be there. So what we're seeing with them is just increased quit rates. They're quitting at a higher level than they were pre-pandemic. And I think that we all need to be prepared as leaders in organizations that's going to continue. The key still is how do we help those folks connect to the mission of the organization so that they're really aligned and energized as employees.
Can I add something to you on that one?
Absolutely.
I think there's also a real need. I think the people who are in those types of roles are looking for some of the flexibility that they've seen knowledge workers having with
Right.
being able to work remote and being able to flex their time and to be able to incorporate life into it. And they don't have that because they're
right.
working on a shift where you have to be fully present and on site. And so I know there's some thoughts around adding in, for some employers, they're looking at how do you give them flex days to go off site for education. I mean, trying to figure out ways to provide them some type of flexibility because if you're manufacturing, somebody's got to be there to do that point when it's
Right.
when it's your turn. And how do you create that? It's a really tough issue. But I think the equity and the feeling of inequity comes into play.
Right, and the burnout that's happening at the same time.
Yes.
Right. Let's talk about work-life balance, because I've heard this term so often and don't fully comprehend. In fact, I have a friend that said, I know balance, I recognize it every time I swing right by it. And so what are we seeing in terms of work-life balance with both remote workers and people that don't have that luxury?
Well, I think the term work-life balance is probably a little outdated because in reality, if you're a hybrid worker or a fully remote worker, you really probably don't have a true work-life balance. You do have increased flexibility to choose when you work. Maybe you're going to knock off at 3 o'clock because you're going to go pick up the kids and you're going to log back on after everybody's asleep at 7 or 8 and do a couple more hours. Employees who have the ability to do that actually report less stress. They're usually more engaged in the workplace. So I think our definition of work-life balance is changing both on the company side and certainly on the individual side. I think that's the dramatic shift that's going on. And part of the driver is we don't really quite understand that balance yet. I don't really know exactly what my manager expects of me, so I'm not sure how to handle that. And I certainly don't know how to deal with it in my personal life with workspace in the home and those kinds of things.
And I think
Go ahead.
Thank you. I think there also comes into creating boundaries. So
Right.
if I should be able to create boundaries, but I may not feel comfortable enough to have those conversations with my manager.
Define boundaries.
Boundaries are I need the evenings with my family. I need to take the time off on 2 days, maybe Saturday and Sunday, to be with my family. I'm going to carve that out to be when I work. I'm not going to take calls late at night unless it's an emergency.
And how are managers responding to this when people are saying, these are all my demands or kind of thing?
Well, I don't know if they're necessarily having those conversations. That's what I'm saying. When you were saying like managers where there's an opportunity there, I'm not sure people feel comfortable saying, hey, Vince,
Right.
I'd like to talk to you about my boundaries. Well, that's kind of awkward feeling. But
Right.
I mean, if you're having conversations, hopefully with the manager is able to create create a space to have a conversation and to be able to listen to what the person needs and to as you check in, like, how are things going? Tell me about what's causing you stress.
Right. And it is fascinating. So one key driver, when you're able to have those conversations with your manager, it creates trust. And we know that trust from anyone trust is the currency of the employer-employee relationship. It's actually the currency of every human relationship. So when we can build trust in the workplace, so I can have that conversation, hey Vince, I need to knock off early, but I'll be back online later. That creates better engagement from the employee, more satisfaction with the job, and it creates the atmosphere for great performance.
Yeah, but trust, let's talk about this, because there's remote monitoring and how many mouse clicks are there and all this, and you even see that on social media where somebody figured out how to push a mouse around with a robot or something.
Yeah.
I mean, what's going on with being monitored?
That kind of indicates something, huh?
Oh,
Like
yeah.
maybe there's a lack of trust.
Right.
Yeah.
And then disengagement, and then all this
Yeah,
effect.
because
So,
if you don't trust me to do my job and you're monitoring my mouse, I would much rather have a direct conversation that says, Melissa, how are you doing? Let's talk about your productivity. I'd like to understand what all you're doing. I would much rather have a conversation be treated as an adult and a professional than the other, to have my mouse monitored.
In fact, if you're going to measure it by the clicks on a mouse, you're going to probably live with very high turnover for a very long time in the future.
Yeah.
but we saw an increase in productivity during the pandemic. So, what's going on then, and what happened then, and what's happening today?
Well, then, number one, workers were really scared that they're going to lose their job, so they worked really hard, really long hours to make sure they were performing well. But you think about it, it was the epitome of trust in the workplace. I know yesterday was normal, but today, here's your screen, your computer, please go home and come back when we'll tell you to. And those dates continue to be pushed out. It was the epitome of a high trust environment. It was forced on us, but it certainly was effective. And there's a lot of research that says workers responded really well to that. Yeah. So part of that is the hope for the future, right? We've had a model that's worked well. Right. Where can we continue that?
So, Melissa, what other challenges have we not discussed so far that we're facing in the workforce today?
We also need to think about the labor shortage. So over time, there's been a decrease in births. I mean, we have had the baby boomers have been leaving the workforce at a higher rate through the pandemic, so we have less knowledge and less skills. We have the women leaving. We also have men leaving the workforce. So when we think about the people that we have and the changes, I mean, if we talked about seismic changes in work, let's not forget what's going on in technology. So how are we able to keep up with that? And I think employers are having to think about how to invest and where to invest in skilling people, because we're not necessarily going to have a skilled person coming in and being able to apply to all of our roles. As employers, we're going to have to invest in tooling people to be able to do the roles.
Okay, so talent, getting them up to speed on where we're headed, basically. Jimmy, how about you? What evolution do you see in the workforce?
Well, Melissa kind of referred to it earlier, too. I think we're going to have to think differently about employees for a while. We may have to think differently about our own careers, because there's going to be an increased growth in older employees. I speak to a lot of HR groups around the country. I always ask how old their oldest employee is, and you always have one's past 65, but this was actually pre-pandemic. I had two different companies in Oklahoma City who had employees still on the payroll full-time over age 90. And that's the fastest growing segment of our population. Workers age 16 to about 35 are going to be shrinking in numbers over the next few years. Workers past age 65 and even past age 70 or 75 are going to be growing at a pretty rapid clip. So we've got to think about how to engage and motivate the older employees, attract them back into the workforce, and maybe workplace flexibility so they've got the ability to do that well. That's a huge change. But the other thing I think that employers really have to think about is the war for talent is not going to go away, even in the midst of a potential recession. We're going to be faced with this shortage of people for 15, 20, 25 years. So it's going to take a very different thinking outside of the box a bit and that issue.
I agree. I think it's really going to be focusing in on the employee experience.
Yes.
So really, I think employers are going to have to look at their employees really as their customers. So how am I going to re-recruit? How am I going to re-engage with those people so that they have the passion and the excitement to go on. And I think there's a lot with focusing in on the values and the culture, and bringing people together so that they have that sense of community. When you think about what we've been through in the pandemic and people working remotely, they've been really isolated, and they're hungry for that.
Can I interrupt? So values and culture, I heard that, and I heard, well, whose responsibility are that? And then I started to think, well, is it the employees supposed to be clear on their values as well? So give us a bit of commentary on the values and the culture, and where does the responsibility lie there?
I think it starts with the leadership. It starts with the leadership defining what the values are for the organization and really defining what they want the organization to look like. And then it's approaching it by building a purposeful culture. And you can do that by tying things back to your values and being really clear about that with the mission. So you talk about that with your employees, you hire against that so that you have the right people around the table working together. And it just really builds that momentum and that belongingness. Yeah.
Any insight?
Well, in many ways, I think the responsibility does lie certainly with the employer, but also with the employee. I've got a responsibility not just for my employer, but to my career to show up and do a good job every day. And the great thing is, if I can't do that where I'm at today, there's never been a better time to look for a job than today. We have 10 million open jobs today, only about 6 million workers who are looking for those jobs. So even if everybody takes a role, there's still some roles left over.
Well, here's a media soundbite. I've heard a bunch. Don't know if they're. Let's talk about the 4-day work week. Now, that has been on the radar a bunch recently, but is it a thing? Are we seeing some efficacy in the workplace? Are people obviously maybe resonating to that? What are you seeing? Go ahead.
The early stats are that it's going really well. Almost every company who's trialed it has adopted it for a longer term. Now, we don't know yet if that's just because of worker enthusiasm, right? I'm so energized by this opportunity that I'm going to really do a little bit better than I was doing. We don't know if that'll endure or not, but certainly so far, it looks like that could be terrific.
Could be. And it's worked for a long time in manufacturing.
Right.
Yeah.
I hear it's working in Europe. Is that true? I mean, isn't that the standard? Oh, what are they doing in France?
Yeah. It is working well in Europe. Yeah.
Okay, the 4-day work week. Here we come.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about the pandemic. The COVID came upon us. What have you seen, and what kind of effect did COVID have on our workplace during the pandemic, but actually after as well? What kinds of effect did it have on our workforce?
I think it had it just turned everything upside down, and all of a sudden you had people working. Everybody was at home. So you had a lot of stress going on around how to manage that, how to manage the schedules and stuff. And as people are coming out of it, I think there's still some of that isolation. There's some mental health concerns, and those are popping up. And those are going to be, we don't even know what the impact is going to be or has been. I think it's still too soon to know.
Okay, gotcha. It's playing out in front of our eyes. Yeah.
That's said much better than what I just said.
Okay. Jimmy?
Yeah, it's the mental health issues. Melissa said it well. It is playing out right before our eyes. But I think one other thing that we all talk about, and I don't know that we necessarily correlated to the pandemic, but I really think that was a big driver, was just the lack of civility in our culture overall, but in the workplace as well. We had the ability for a long time to hide behind an email that can be very easily misconstrued and the things we were saying, and it created a lot of discord among employees. But that was taken to a new height when people working remotely. They may be working with newcomers that they never met. And even if they were in person, they were behind a mask and they felt a little bit safer. So this whole civility issue has taken a life of its own. And I think it's one of the things that we're struggling with in the workplace, and we've got to really figure out a good way to address. It manifests across our culture, so it's certainly not limited to the workplace, but it's a huge issue, and I think the pandemic accelerated it.
Right.
I think you're absolutely right. And you're right. What's going on in our culture and what we see every night on the news
Right.
and in the media,
Correct.
It's absolutely exacerbated it.
Well, this is the part of the program where we're talking to our viewers. What kinds of things can we do personally in terms of our place in the workforce, but also if there's managers out there as well that are viewing, what kinds of things would you recommend they do? So, Melissa, I'll start with you, and Jimmy, you're next.
I think it's the big things are really the little things are what's really important. The checking in with people, having the conversation, really setting clear expectations, talking and finding ways to recognize and reward and talk about the future, talk about what people want, and then meeting people where they are. You don't, talking about the communications,
Right.
you don't know where somebody is, and we don't know everything that's going on. So I think having the conversation and really getting to know somebody so you know how to meet them where they are is going to be critical for that employee experience.
Right. Jimmy?
Restate the question?
Well, what can managers look at in terms of, and then what individuals in the workplace?
Let's start with individuals. I think as individuals, we recognize the unique opportunity we have in a world that's very talent short. almost no matter the age, if you decide to get additional skills training, upskilling, you're going to have some great opportunities over the next few years. And I think that's something to be celebrated. It's often lost in the shuffle. So for the individual, I think there's some great opportunities. For organizations and companies, I don't think there's ever been a time when companies could make such an impact, not only on their corporate culture, but just the larger community around them. And if you look at the ideas of conscious capitalism or companies who really have mastered this way of taking care of their people, they're having tremendous financial results, which is great, but they're really transforming communities. They're transforming individuals. So I do think it's a unique opportunity that we've not seen in the workplace before.
Well, if I could summarize what I'm hearing here, communication is critical both ways, communicating where you're at and what you're looking for, but also clarifying what we need from an organizational standpoint and clear on what we do as individuals. So that summarize our conversation to a degree, because we have reached the end. And,
How is that possible?
Yes, it happens that fast. But I so appreciate having both of you here today. Thanks so much for joining us today. We trust the different perspectives you heard will give you more clarity regarding the news of this issue as it passes by us daily. As always, we continue talking about things that matter with people who care, thanks to viewers like you.